Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we're going to travel across the steppes, deserts, and mountains, following the trails of ancient caravans. Moreover, we will travel over time. You have certainly heard of the Silk Road, a trade route that linked China in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, lasting for centuries. But how exactly did it work? Why did it appear? Was it a single route or were there several? Who transported these precious goods over thousands of miles? What unfolded during more than 1,500 years of activity? How did the world change as a result of this early form of trade globalization? This is what we are going to explore. But before we do, I'd like to take 1 minute of your time to let you know that we do have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly contribute to our work financially. If you join, you will get various new things, like the possibility to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and regular bonus episodes. We already have 3 episodes available only to our Patreons, with the latest one being about the Library of Alexandria, and the 4th one is coming soon. You will be able to download all these audios, and you will have your say on the choice of topics. This topic was selected by our Patreons. We have advanced releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. You will find a link in the description box and in the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume later or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Feel your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, let's begin, shall we? The Silk Road is an invitation to ask ourselves about the origins of long-distance trade in human history. Interestingly, long before the establishment of the Silk Road, historians had pondered the inception of this specific route, or more accurately, this network. We'll explore why. The creation of this network is generally attributed to the 2nd century BC, some 2,100 years ago. It resulted from the expansion of the imperial Han Dynasty in China into Central Asia, pacifying regions previously deemed too treacherous to cross. This move positioned the Han Empire adjacent to other large empires of the time, the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire, with its heart in Persia, stretched from Turkey to Afghanistan. These two large entities functioned as a link between East Asia and the Mediterranean Sea. Both empires were mutually interested in trade, buying and selling goods they required. Consequently, it was this shared interest that initiated the inception of such an extensive trade route. However, exchanges across Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Africa existed long before this. This fact is demonstrated by, for instance, the discovery of remnants that are likely Chinese silk in ancient Egypt, dating back to the 11th century BC, a full millennium before the opening of the Silk Road. Another instance was the unearthing of silk and belt ornaments of Chinese origin in a tomb near Stuttgart in Germany, dated to the 8th century BC. So goods were capable of far-reaching travel even without the existence of the Silk Road. Another critical trading network across Eurasia was the steppe route, which was established at least 2,000 years before the Silk Road came into existence. On this steppe route, diverse goods, including silk, were exchanged, as well as fur, precious stones, and jewels, musical instruments, and notably Central Asian horses, which were coveted by the Chinese. This informal steppe route was kept functioning for many generations by the nomadic tribes residing from Ukraine to Mongolia, and we know they existed thanks to archaeological discoveries, where artifacts were located in tombs or ruins thousands of miles from their origin. Examples include the silk pieces I mentioned before, discovered in Egypt and Germany, and precious stones, such as jade and lapis lazuli, that had traveled significant distances. It is believed that these long-distance exchanges appeared because of the lifestyle of the peoples who occupied the steppes of Eastern Europe and Asia. Even though they were in contact with fixed settlements and had developed their own crafts and a certain level of technical advancement, they maintained their nomadic lifestyle. As such, they were often on the move over a large territory without fixed borders. They had large areas they considered their own. And they also had neighbors and were well placed to connect peoples living far apart by transporting goods. This steppe route was certainly not as intentional as the Silk Road would be. It seems that it appeared spontaneously as a vast network of peoples who knew their immediate neighbors, and across this vast area, goods and cultures circulated. Another precursor trade route to the Silk Road was the so-called Jade Road. Jade was very sought after in China. It came from Central Asia and Burma, crossing the Himalayan mountains to arrive in Yunnan, in the south of China. This journey traversed some of the most remote and difficult regions in the world. Jade, a mineral that can range in color from green to white, was highly valued because it was believed to provide power and protection to kings and emperors. As a result, they patronized this trade. An illustration of cultural influences from afar is seen in Chinese crafts made with jade from the first millennium BC. These pieces drew inspiration from the styles of the Scythians, nomadic peoples from the steppes of Western Asia and Eastern Europe, centuries before opening the Silk Road. Other people with whom the Chinese traded were the Sogdians, who lived in what is today Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. In the first millennium BC, Sogdiana, the land of the Sogdians, constantly changed hands under the influence of different invaders. These included the Persians, the Persian Empire, and the Greeks or the Macedonians, following the invasion of Alexander the Great. Despite frequent changes in governance, Sogdiana maintained a propensity for international trade, with various cities extracting important resources from it. The most notable city was Samarkand, which eventually became one of the most significant stops for caravans along the Silk Road. The importance of these examples regarding the steppe route, or the Jade Road, is that commercial routes had appeared before the Silk Road. This explains how Chinese artifacts ended up in Europe or Egypt. The artifacts most likely arrived there in very small quantities and almost accidentally, after having changed hands several times, rather than through a trade route with the explicit intent to export them from China to the other side of the ancient world. The impulse to create a commercial road was given by the Chinese in the 2nd century BC. But why? China had unified under the first emperor Qin, and the subsequent Han Dynasty expanded towards Central Asia. The Han administration became aware that significant developed cities were situated inland in Central Asia. Realizing their potential, they dispatched embassies. The emperor received reports from his ambassadors, particularly Zhang Qian in late 2nd century BC, who advocated for the establishment of trade relations. Central Asia offered attractive goods, including gold, precious stones, and other valuable materials, as well as horses. These commodities could be traded for Chinese products like tea, silk, lacquer, and various handcrafted items. Ambassador Zhang Qian also reported on neighboring countries further west and south, such as Persia, which was controlled by the Parthians, and other nations such as India and Mesopotamia. One detail that particularly intrigued China was the fact that Central Asia bred tall and powerful horses, superior in combat than those in China. As the Chinese frequently faced skirmishes with nomadic tribes along their northern and western frontiers, peoples who relied heavily on horses, the Chinese found such horses extremely valuable. So, with the emperor's blessing, the creation and supervision of a commercial route was established, stretching thousands of miles from China to Central Asia. This policy was consistently upheld for decades. Merchants in Central Asia realized that a demand for these Chinese products likely extended even further west, towards the Middle East. Believing potential clients to exist in those regions, they transported these desired goods overland, continually extending what is now known as the Silk Road. Also, during the 1st century BC, an alternative route to India was opened by sea. It initiated in the north of modern Vietnam, in the region of Jiaoqi, which at the time was ruled by the Chinese, and navigated through ports on the coasts of India and Sri Lanka. This route extended all the way to the Middle East, culminating in the Red Sea. Ships on this maritime route, or caravans on the land route, did not traverse the entire distance from China to the Western world. From the beginning, trade along this extensive route was facilitated by middlemen. Indian traders purchased the goods in India and transported them westward to resell at a profit. Similar practices were adopted by peoples from the Central Asian steppes and deserts on the land route. So the first merchants on the Silk Road never journeyed to the opposite end. They brought the goods to ports, trading posts, or marketplaces, where the goods changed hands, sometimes multiple times, and carried on until they reached their final destination months later. This is why many historians consider the term Silk Road a bit misleading. In fact, there were several routes, and they formed a network with alternative paths, not a single land road. The land route through Eurasia was significant, but it is believed that the most important one, in terms of the volume of goods traded over the centuries, was the maritime route. This route crossed the Indian Ocean, and the products that transited were not only from China or the Mediterranean. There were also spices from Southeast Asia, and gold and ivory from Africa, as well as Indian textiles and gems. In the 1st century BC, while the Han Dynasty ruled over a unified China in the east, the dominating power in the west was the Roman Republic, soon to become the Roman Empire. As the Chinese expanded to their west, the Romans were expanding to their east, reaching as far as Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Between these two blocs, Rome and China, there were several kingdoms and states. Of these, the most important was the Persian Parthian Empire, which would become an archenemy of the Romans. But despite the distance, the Romans and Chinese still became aware of each other. Archaeological finds on both sides attest to an indirect trade between the two. In China, Roman glassware and silverware have been found in tombs. Additionally, many Roman coins and medallions from the 1st century AD onwards have been discovered. Sometimes coins are not the best indicator, as they could have arrived in China several centuries after they were minted. However, there are enough sites and artifacts to confirm that they arrived in China 2,000 years prior. Interestingly, many Roman remains were found in Jiaoqi, a historical region in North Vietnam, which was the final stop of the maritime road on the Chinese side. But this trade was indirect. The real level of mutual awareness, namely how much each side knew about the other, remains a topic of speculation and investigation. There could have been Chinese embassies in Rome, but it's hard to conclusively determine this based on Roman archives. This is because envoys from the east of their empire, beyond the Parthian Empire, were collectively referred to as Saras by the Romans. They did not clearly distinguish between Indians, Chinese, or other Asian peoples in their chronicles and literature. Apart from official embassies, multiple encounters with merchants from Serica, this undefined land of the Saras, are mentioned in Roman writings. But there is no certainty that these merchants actually were Chinese. On the Chinese side, knowledge of the Romans did not seem to me much more extensive. They had a name from the Roman Empire, Daqin, Chinese ambassadors to the Parthian Empire, with whom they had regular diplomatic relations, wrote reports, including secondhand testimonies, about Rome in the 1st century AD. In some texts, Chinese historians of the past allude to Roman embassies in China during the 2nd century. However, this claim is dubious, as these chronicles were written later, and such embassies are absent from Roman historiography. So, what we can conclude from this is that the Chinese and the Romans, the two most formidable empires of the world in the 1st centuries of our era, were aware of each other's existence. They knew that some of the products they received came from the other empire, including Roman glassware in China and Chinese silk in Rome. But they only had a vague idea about the exact location and borders of the other empire due to the significant distance. Moreover, there are no signs of continuous diplomatic contacts, yet records on both sides illustrate how this long-distance trade brought prosperity. In China, silk was a luxury product that was only accessible to the highest and wealthiest classes of society, starting with the imperial court. Its sale abroad at a very high price became a lucrative activity, especially for the state that tightly controlled the production. For the Romans, access to these Eastern goods began on a larger scale after the conquest of Egypt and Syria, particularly Egypt, which had trade connections with India. By the time of Augustus, at the start of the 1st century AD, there were up to 120 ships setting sail every year from Roman Egypt to India. They traveled along the coastline because ocean-going sailing was very limited and dangerous at the time. From the 1st century onward, a craze for silk developed in Rome. However, the Romans did not know how silk was made. They assumed it was obtained from a tree. Consequently, they were very far from being able to produce silk themselves. They later learned that the fiber came from a specific caterpillar, but didn't know how to replicate the production process. As a result, all of their silk had to be imported. A lot of this silk arrived by land, as we saw before. It was not sold directly by Chinese merchants. It was supplied by the Parthians, who had bought it in Central Asia. At least it was provided when intermittent wars with the Romans allowed it. Sometimes wars would cut the land supply, which only made silk more difficult to find and therefore more desirable and expensive. Alongside it arrived spices and perfumes that also became very sought-after luxury goods for wealthy Romans. Rome had products to export too, like silverware and glassware. However, their value was far less from truly matching the imports from Asia. Early on, this trade imbalance became a source of concern for authorities, as the difference had to be paid in gold. This created an outflow of gold to Asia. In reaction, authorities attempted to limit silk imports. The Roman Senate issued several edicts to condemn the wearing of silk on economic and moral grounds. Silk clothes were called decadent and immoral because they were very thin, much thinner and lighter than traditional Roman fabrics. The real concern, however, was this outflow of gold, and neither moral nor economic condemnations managed to halt the appetite for silk. The Chinese and the Romans were not the only ones to benefit. In between them, there were all these middlemen from India, Central Asia, and the Middle East who contributed to the functioning of their segment on the Silk Road by acquiring goods and transporting them forward, as well as selling them locally. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of people lived from this trade, from porters to wealthy merchants who armed ships or organized caravans on land. Traveling in groups on land for safety and economies of scale was an ancient practice, but it became standard on the Silk Road. As soon as the Chinese began to impel the Silk Road to Central Asia, they dispatched caravans. With a regular flow of these caravans, accommodations and resting places became essential along the Silk Road, leading to the proliferation of specialized inns known as caravanserais. The word caravan derives from the Persian term caravan, while sarai denotes a palace or a building with enclosed courts. While traversing deserts or mountains, caravanners would simply camp in the open, with guards keeping watch at night. This was needed as the goods they transported could potentially attract bands of thieves. But when on other parts of the Silk Road, like the actual roads, or when they crossed cities, the caravanners required places to stay. These places of refuge were the caravanserais, which were often located along roads in the countryside or on the outskirts of cities. Caravanserais were enclosed to offer protection, along with providing access to water, food, space for animals like horses or camels, and dormitories for men. These establishments didn't originate with the Silk Road. They were already present in India and in the Persian Empire, but became increasingly common and appeared in new regions with the surge of caravans. During the Islamic period, which commenced several centuries after opening the Silk Road, caravanserais became a prevalent type of structure from Western China to North Africa. Urban caravanserais evolved into more than inns, often situated near the bazaar, the primary market. They became the hub for goods arrival and departure, providing economic activities including offering goods to buy or sell, job opportunities, and became integral to the city's daily life. The historic centers of many old cities across the Muslim world still reflects this past, from Fez in Morocco to Istanbul in Turkey or Cairo in Egypt. Typically, the caravanserai was a building with a square or rectangular outer wall and a single entrance, a porthole, wide enough to let large, heavy-laden beasts such as camels enter. The building was organized around a courtyard that opened up into the sky. Around the courtyard were animal stalls, rooms, and chambers designed to accommodate people, animals, and merchandise. Sometimes the more elaborate caravanserais provided hammams, or public baths. They also had shops where travelers could acquire needed equipment. Caravanserai structures during medieval times sometimes added more floors, who provided rental apartments for low-income inhabitants. From the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, both ends of the Silk Road experienced a long period of relative prosperity and stability. Trade flourished. However, as history unfolded, the two mighty empires of the East and the West confronted challenges. In China, the Han Dynasty, which had ruled over and unified the territory for the most part of 4 centuries, eventually collapsed, initiating a period of fragmentation into different states. This period in the 3rd century is known as the Three Kingdoms period. Looking back, the Han period is often considered a golden age for China. Despite its internal conflicts, warfare on the borders, and power shifts from one branch of the Han Dynasty to another at the beginning of the 1st century AD, it was an extended period of relative stability when classical Chinese culture could flourish. In the West, the Roman Empire, which had reached its peak in the 2nd century, entered a major crisis in the 3rd century. This crisis led to its fracture and increased pressures on its borders that it had a hard time defending. The Silk Road did not close, as it constituted a network with different routes, allowing it to adapt. However, its function was seriously disrupted due to the loss of control by states on the routes through Central Asia and around the Mediterranean. Finally, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, disappearing as an end client. It would take centuries before Western Europe became a significant client again for sophisticated Chinese and Asian goods. What remained was the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, which was still formidable. The eastern half of the empire had not been ravaged by wars and invasions like in the West, and it even reconquered large parts of the Western Empire. It was at war with the successors of the Parthians in Persia, Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians controlled half of the Middle East, the other significant power in the region being Byzantium. However, due to their geographic positioning, they controlled all commercial routes that went through Iran. The demand for silk and other exotic products persisted in Byzantium. North of the Sasanians in West and Central Asia, a new major power had emerged: the Turkic Khaganate. This was a massive inland empire, essentially populated by various nomadic peoples who had been unified by a Turkic clan. Turkic peoples are a collection of diverse ethnic groups that originated from West and Central Asia. They were unified by language and cultural traits, but they are not a single ethnicity. They are distinct from modern Turks, but historically related. The Turkish population emerged from a mix of Turkic invaders with the locals who lived in Turkey during late antiquity and in the Middle Ages. This meant that by the 6th century AD, the Turkic Khaganate had expanded to cover a vast area, stretching from Mongolia in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. Despite its size, it was not densely populated, and culturally, it was a collection of different peoples, including the Sogdians from Central Asia that I mentioned before. Sogdian was one of the official languages of this Khaganate, along with Old Turkic, A Khaganate is a term that refers to a chiefdom or a kingdom. It is typically used for the Turkic, Mongol, and Tatar populations of Asia who were ruled by a Khan, or chief. With its vast territories connecting the east and west, the Turkic Khaganate was strategically placed to manage a significant portion of the overland route to and from China. This was especially true after the Chinese lost control of their possessions in Central Asia, following the fall of the Han Dynasty. In the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian II formed an alliance with the Turkic Khaganate against their common enemy, the Sasanians. He bypassed the Sasanians for the silk trade, dealing directly with the Sogdian merchants living in the Turkic Khaganate. However, the Byzantines accomplished more than just this. They managed to steal the secret of silk making. 50 years prior to this alliance, Emperor Justinian sent monks as spies along the Silk Road from Constantinople to China. These spies successfully procured silkworm eggs and brought them back to Constantinople. This allowed the Byzantines to start their own silk production. This became a profitable activity for the Eastern Roman Empire, which controlled the monopoly over silk production for centuries in the Mediterranean. This production was centered around Constantinople and northern Greece. Despite their efforts, they could not rival the Chinese in terms of quality. China already had thousands of years of experience in silk making at this point. The luxury of Chinese silk outclassed that of Byzantine silk, so it did not halt imports. Proof that the Silk Road was still operative during the late antiquity is the discovery of coins minted in Constantinople during the 6th century found in Chinese tombs. The story of Byzantium is one of a very long and slow decline, interspersed with periods of recovery and conquest, as well as collapse. However, during the 6th century, Byzantium was still in good shape and was expanding. The Chinese noticed that the Roman Empire had undergone changes. Though not fully aware of the specifics, they knew that the old Roman Empire, referred to as Qing, had been fractured or had changed capitals. They named the Byzantine Empire Fulan and recognized it as good end customers for silk, lacquer, and ceramics. Then came the 7th century, bringing significant changes to the Silk Road. Two major events happened. First, the rise of the Tang Dynasty in China, which is considered a golden age. The Tang reunified China under their rule and reconquered the western regions, waging war against the Turkics and the Tibetans. They regained control over the Silk Road, as they commanded a substantial portion of the land route to the west. This allowed them to establish direct trade with the Sogdians in Central Asia and the Persian merchants. This control over regions far from the historical Chinese heartland is sometimes called Pax Sinica. Equivalent to the term Pax Romana, coined to signify the stability and peace contributed to the domination of the Roman Empire. There had been a first Pax Sinica under the Han, and the new one, the second one, under the Tang. Compared to previous periods, The Tang Dynasty was more outward-looking. They encouraged commerce and welcomed foreigners to some of their cities. Furthermore, they extended their maritime influence. Chinese envoys had been navigating through the Indian Ocean to India for several centuries, and during the Tang Dynasty, they extended their reach beyond India to the Persian Gulf and all of Africa. The other major change in the 7th century was the rise of Islam, which expanded rapidly from Arabia, primarily to the expense of Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire, the latter being the last pre-Islamic state in Iran. After the conquest, Iran was mostly converted to Islam. However, in return, Persian culture also strongly influenced the Muslim states of the Middle East. Far from destroying the Silk Road, all these changes reinforced it. After the destruction left by the conquest, the Islamic Caliphate was rebuilt and became a major trade partner with Central Asia and China. The Muslim conquest extended to Central Asia. In the 8th century, until it clashed with the Chinese and their westward expansion, a large battle occurred in 751, the Battle of the Talas, between the Abbasid Caliphate and its allies from the Tibetan Empire, and an army of the Tang. The Muslim side won the battle, but after that, trade resumed because it was advantageous for both sides. Though it is disputed, the consequences of this military clash could have been the further dissemination of Chinese technology and techniques to the West. The Abbasid took hundreds of prisoners of war who were taken to Abbasid territory and would have lived there using the crafts they knew, including silk weaving and paper making. This would have permitted the transfer of technology. Paper making was widespread in China, whereas in the Middle East and the Mediterranean world, the most common forms of support for writing were papyrus, with parchment as a high-end alternative. Parchment is animal skin. By the end of the 8th century, paper making spread throughout the Islamic world. The first paper mill was built in Baghdad in 794-795, and paper started to replace papyrus. It is uncertain whether the prisoners of the Battle of the Talas were responsible for the technology transfer or not, but one way or another, this particular trade was disseminated, imitating Chinese techniques. From the 8th to the 10th centuries, the Islamic world fractured into many states, often rivals. Despite this, the Silk Road entered a new golden age. It was still operated by people from Central Asia like the Sogdians and the Turkics, now converted to Islam for the majority of them, by the Persians, the Arabs, the Byzantines. There are plenty of signs of cultural exchange between East and West, especially in decorative arts. Muslim craftsmen were inspired by Chinese aesthetics and vice versa. Some Chinese ceramics, for example, emulated the kind of geometric and floral patterns from Islamic art. Byzantium had shrunk to Anatolia, that is to say, modern Turkey, and the south of the Balkans, but it was also an important contributor to the Silk Road, as an importer of Chinese crafts and an exporter of glassware and enamels. The maritime route in the Indian Ocean was flourishing due to the spice trade. Concurrently, in the West, Europe was beginning to re-emerge on the trade map. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe, once an active participant on the Silk Road that stretched as far as Rome, became significantly lesser involved. From the 5th century onward, the road culminated in the Levant and Constantinople, with very few exotic products reaching Western Europe. However, the kingdoms of Western Europe, emerging from the Dark Ages, rekindled their interest in spices and luxury products. This resurgence made fortunes for Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, and economically bolstered Byzantium, the natural gateway to the East for Europeans. Goods arriving in Constantinople or other ports of Byzantium were brought to Italy by Italian merchants, and from there they were re-exported to Western Europe. This trade was not only fraught with risks, such as interruptions from wars and threats from piracy, but was also extremely lucrative. It transformed economies and societies, much like it had for Central Asian nomadic peoples, Chinese craftsmen, and Muslim merchants in earlier times. It stimulated the production of crafts for export, introduced new products that altered tastes, led to the emergence of a wealthy merchant class, changed the lifestyles of the affluent who could afford foreign goods. Innovative savings and business management strategies. This interconnectedness with distant parts of the world sometimes had catastrophic consequences. A prime example of this is the spread of the Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that struck in the 14th century. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasion led by Genghis Khan overwhelmed China. The Mongol Empire then expanded swiftly to become the largest land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from China and Mongolia to the Middle East. The Mongol conquest was brutal and led to extensive loss of life and destruction, but it was followed by efficient administration. After more and more provinces were included within the Mongol Empire during its expansion in the 13th and 14th centuries, they became more interconnected and relatively spared from warfare. The Mongols favored trade not only for its economic advantages, but also as a way to unify their gigantic empire, which encompassed very diverse peoples. They protected and promoted the Silk Road, which had essentially become an internal trade axis, connecting their Chinese holdings in the East to their more recently conquered provinces in the Middle East. In China, Mongol rulers became emperors, establishing what is known as the Yuan dynasty. They reunified China and made it the economic heartland of their empire. Trade brought great prosperity to some Chinese and Central Asian cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. For a time, it also reinvigorated Arab cities like Baghdad, which had been devastated by the invasion. However, the empire served as a conduit for much more than goods. Pathogens could also travel across its vast reach. The bubonic plague, caused by a bacterium spread by fleas that lived on rats, also easily infected humans. It is generally believed that the bacterium took a secondary form during the pandemic that made it communicable through person-to-person contact. This bacterium is thought to have originally appeared in Central Asia, specifically in the Tian Shan Mountains on the border of modern China, Kyrgyzstan, about 2,600 years ago. From there, it spread on multiple occasions, leading to various ancient and medieval epidemics. However, the outbreak in the 14th century was on a completely different scale. It is supposed to have been introduced to Europe during a siege. The Genoese, who had acquired the port of Kaffa in Crimea and used it as a trading post, were directly linked to the trade activity with the East. The port was besieged by the Golden Horde, the Khaganate that ruled over the northwestern sector of the Mongol Empire. The plague had traveled from Central Asia to Crimea along the Silk Road, and the Golden Horde soldiers were succumbing to it. Instead of retreating, the armies threw their bodies over the walls of Kaffa. Thus, the epidemic began in Kaffa too. From there, it most likely spread all around the Mediterranean, reaching Constantinople, then Italy, North Africa, and soon all of Europe. This dispersion was probably facilitated by fleas living on rats that travel on Genoese ships. For several years, the pandemic ravaged Europe and the Middle East, killing more than a third of the population. People had no understanding of how the disease spread. They realized that avoiding contact and closing world cities could help, and this measure saved many lives. But from 1346 to 1353, the disease advanced unchecked. This might have occurred without the Silk Road, and more broadly, without the existence of trade routes connecting Asia to Europe. However, the rapid and destructive spread was likely due to the intense activity of caravans and the movement of populations within the Mongol Empire, which had effectively transformed the Silk Road into a highway for pathogens. Before this happened in the 13th century, Western Europeans had begun to reinvest in and explore this trade connection with the Far East. Essentially, they were missionaries and merchants. The most famous among them was undoubtedly Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant and explorer who traveled by land. He was, however, not the first. His predecessors are lesser known because their accounts were less widely read, and they failed to make a significant impact in Western Europe. Notable individuals included William Robruk, a Flemish missionary and explorer, Benedict of Poland, a Franciscan friar, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, an Italian diplomat, and André of Longjumeau, a French missionary. All of these men journeyed to the heart of the Mongol Empire. Some were even received at the court of the Great Khan. They began to inform Europe about the customs, languages, and political situations in the Far East. Marco Polo, however, provided a particularly comprehensive and successful account. So, who was Marco Polo? Despite his fame, there are plenty of unknowns about his life. We know he was born around 1254 in Venice into a family of merchants. His father and his uncle were traveling merchants who entered the business together before Marco was born. Like other Venetian merchants, they established trading posts in different locations, including at least one in Constantinople and another in Crimea. At the time, Venetian and general merchants followed this route. They employed individuals who would manage day-to-day activities like receiving shipments from other trading posts, buying and selling goods, maintaining records, and looking for opportunities. The job of creating and maintaining this network involved regular travel and exploration. His father and uncle were particularly enterprising because while Marco was still a child, they followed the Silk Road all the way to the Far East and met with the Mongol Emperor of China, Kublai Khan. They were among the handful of Western Europeans who traveled to China by land in the 13th century. They returned safely to Venice in 1269 when Marco was 15. They had been absent for so long that Marco had yet to meet his father. His mother had passed away, so he was raised by an aunt and another uncle. He received a comprehensive education geared towards becoming a merchant like his family members, learning subjects such as cargo ship operation, foreign currency handling, and business conduct. He presumably built a strong relationship with his father and uncle, because 2 years later, at the age of 17, he embarked on a new journey to Asia with them, a journey that would last 24 years. This trip turned out to be quite eventful. The experiences from this journey were later published in a book called The Travels of Marco Polo. This book was widely read beyond Venice, which popularized Marco Polo. This is why his name overshadowed all other European travelers of the Middle Ages to China. However, it wasn't just due to a successful book. His adventures were extraordinary. Along with his father and uncle, they traveled along the Silk Road all the way to China, where they were received for the second time by Kublai Khan. The Khan took a liking to Marco, supposedly because of his intelligence. He appointed him as one of his foreign emissaries. As the envoy of the great Khan and Emperor of China, Marco Polo was sent on many diplomatic missions. The role that had not been held by any other European gave him an opportunity to travel across China and Southeast Asia to India, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. For 17 years, Marco stayed in Asia, serving as a special envoy or a high-ranking official. Around 1291, when Marco was 37 and had spent more than half his life in Asia, he was sent to Persia to accompany a princess, along with his aging father and uncle, who were still alive and had also stayed with him in China. They arrived in Persia in 1293, went on to Constantinople, and finally returned to Venice after 24 years. Marco would have settled in Venice and finally become a merchant, but not yet, because Venice and Genoa were at war. He joined the war effort and was captured by the Genoans. He could have been executed or died in a cell, but fortunately, he ended up in a prison in Genoa with a cellmate, who was also a writer. He dictated his stories to him, and the two co-authored The Travels of Marco Polo. Finally, he was released in 1299, then aged 45. This time, he could return for good to Venice, where he married, had 3 children, and built a fortune for himself, becoming a wealthy merchant. He died there in 1324 at the age of 70. His book became a medieval bestseller, but it was met with skepticism. It sounded a bit too extraordinary to be true. His account was quite different from others who had described the Mongols as barbarians, whereas he presented Chinese civilization and Mongol rule as prosperous and refined, shedding them in a positive light. They did not all have the same experience and saw the same things, which could explain some of these differences. It is also likely that Marco Polo's narrative was embellished, but since then, many details have been proven true and lend credibility to his account. It did not contain gross geographical errors like other accounts. His description of cities, customs, currencies used, and clothing were all proven accurate when compared to archaeological discoveries and Chinese records. Many of his embassies, including the last one when he accompanied a Mongol princess to Persia, were proven to be real. So there were probably exaggerations or embellishments here and there, but he provided the most accurate reports among these European travelers of the Middle Ages. And his book had the most insight because he rose high in Chinese society and stayed there for a long time. The Mongol Empire continued in the 14th century, but then fragmented and declined. The Yuan dynasty in China lost its grip on the country, and the new Chinese dynasty, soon the Ming, replaced it. For the Silk Road, this decline of the Mongols was bad. It had functioned for decades with the Mongolian Empire, for the most part, but its fragmentation separated different states along the Silk Road and made it more difficult and dangerous. In the west, Byzantium was now agonizing and had lost most of Anatolia. Turkey to the Turkic invaders, the Turkmens, and the devastation of the Black Death along the Silk Road had decimated the nomads and cities that lived off of it. Overall, after the collapse of the Mongol Empire, nomadic groups in Central Asia declined significantly. Regional sedentary states emerged instead. So in the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Silk Road declined with them. There was little interest from the Ming Dynasty in China to propel it again. The Ming had a very inward-looking policy, and they discouraged contact with foreigners. The land route across Central Asia was more dangerous, and on the western end of the Silk Road, the Ottoman Empire was rising, eventually cutting Western Europe off from the Eastern trade. This was a significant setback for Italian city-states like Venice. Caravan trade across Asia did not disappear, but it never regained its previous dominance. During the times of Rome and the Han, or the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang were under Mongol control, the significance of the route had been very different. On the maritime route in the Indian Ocean, spices had largely replaced Chinese goods. Consequently, the Silk Road did not close, but became increasingly less relevant. For over 1,500 years, it had been the most important access for world trade, but it was about to be supplanted by more challenging routes and different players. By the end of the 15th century, European explorers had reached America, traversed south of Africa into the Indian Ocean, and soon made their way to Asia unaided. First came the Portuguese from the east, then the Spanish across the Pacific from the west, and they were followed by the Dutch, the French, and the English. These nations reorganized world trade to their profit by sailing directly to India and China, buying the goods they desired without having to rely on any intermediaries, the middlemen who had thrived along the Silk Road for centuries. This is how the Silk Road slowly disappeared, leaving behind watchtowers and ruins, abandoned fortresses, and caravanserais in the wilderness, besides roads that had teemed with caravans for centuries and were now primarily used by locals. Consequently, the centers of world trade shifted to Europe for a few centuries, with cities like Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, and London benefiting the most. Apart from facilitating long-term cultural exchange, the Silk Road is important in its role as a first step in the globalization process, providing a connection between two of the furthest separated points in the known world. Its disappearance had major consequences. It was not the sole reason, but the vanishing of the Silk Road contributed to the Europeans' motivation to seek alternative routes to the Far East during the age of exploration and discovery. Without Chinese silk and porcelain and Asian spices, it remains uncertain what the Portuguese and the Spanish would have sent expeditions across the globe when they did. The history of the world could have been very different under different circumstances. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night, sleep well.